A 70-year-old widowed millionaire suffers a heart attack while buying expensive gifts for his 3 adult children at a luxury mall. When the nurse calls to tell them their father is hospitalized alone, the first son's response is cruel. Is he alive? Then he can wait. The millionaire hears everything and is devastated. On New Year's Eve, while his children party on his yacht using his credit cards, a 7-year-old girl, the janitor's daughter, approaches him in the hospital and asks why he's so sad. When she discovers he'll spend New Year's alone, the girl is shocked and says something he'll never forget. The next day, he makes a decision that will change everything. Edward Morgan walked through the corridors of the luxury mall with measured steps, his hands firmly gripping the handles of designer bags that held the most expensive gifts he had ever bought. At 70, his grey hair was perfectly coiffed, and the impeccably tailored Italian suit disguised the loneliness he had carried in his chest for 3 years, ever since he lost his wife. The scent of imported perfumes from the surrounding boutiques mingled with the aroma of gourmet coffee wafting from the cafes scattered throughout the space. The golden lights reflected off the polished marble floor, creating a festive atmosphere that contrasted with the emptiness Edward felt inside. It was December 29th, and he had just spent a fortune on gifts for his 3 adult children. A $50,000 Swiss watch for Richard, 42, a $35,000 Italian luxury handbag for Patricia, 40, and a $25,000 jewelry set for Camille, the youngest at 38. Each gift had been carefully chosen, not for its sentimental value, but for the impact it would make. Edward had learned over the years that money was his only language of affection with his children. The more expensive the gift, the wider the forced smile he received in return, even if only for a few minutes. Christmas music echoed softly from the speakers, creating a melancholy soundtrack for his thoughts. Edward watched the families passing by, children running excitedly between their parents, young couples choosing modest gifts given with genuine love. He felt a pang of envy for those simple displays of affection. His steps automatically led him toward the main exit, where his driver was waiting. The bags were heavy in his hands, but not as heavy as the weight on his conscience. He knew his children would only show up for New Year's because of the presents, put in a few hours of forced attendance at his mansion, and then disappear again for months. The successful businessman who built a real estate empire from scratch ironically felt like a bankrupt man when it came to relationships. His excessive generosity had become a gilded cage, where every gesture of affection had to be bought. Every moment of his children's attention had a price. Edward paused for a moment in front of a toy store window, looking at a simple doll that cost only $20. He remembered when Camille was little and would spend hours playing with a similar doll, made of cloth that her mother had sewn by hand. Back then, his daughter's smiles were genuine, her hugs spontaneous. A deep sigh escaped his lips as he resumed his path. The mall was beginning to empty, as many stores were preparing to close early for the holiday. The cleaning staff was already starting to make their rounds with their carts, preparing the space for another day of rampant consumerism. He adjusted the knot of his tie, a nervous habit he had developed in recent years. The loneliness intensified during the holidays, when he saw families truly coming together, while his only gathered out of financial interest. As he neared the exit, Edward felt a strange pang in his chest. At first, he dismissed it as the usual anxiety he felt before handing over the gifts and facing another family charade. But the pain quickly intensified, radiating down his left arm. His legs gave out. The designer bags slipped from his grasp, scattering across the marble floor with a dull thud that echoed through the now almost empty corridor. Edward tried to lean on a nearby column, but his body no longer obeyed his commands. The chest pain became unbearable, as if someone was squeezing his heart with brutal force. He collapsed onto the cold floor, his eyes fixing on the golden lights of the ceiling, which now seemed distant and blurry. Edward's last conscious thought before darkness enveloped him was about his children's phone numbers, which he needed to give to the paramedics. Even in that moment of agony, his only concern was making sure they knew what had happened. He had no idea that the response he would receive would be more devastating than the heart attack itself. The monotonous hum of medical equipment echoed in the hospital room, a mechanical symphony that accompanied every irregular beat of Edward's heart. He had regained consciousness a few hours ago, but pretended to be asleep to avoid the doctors' awkward questions about any family who could be with him. Nurse Margaret, a woman in her 50s with brown hair tied in a tight bun, checked his vitals with the efficiency of someone who had worked the night shift for 2 decades. Her kind eyes showed a genuine compassion that only those who care for people in their most vulnerable moments could possess. "Mr. Morgan, I need to contact your family," she said softly, adjusting the pillow behind his head. "You've had a myocardial infarction. It wasn't severe, but you'll need follow-up care, and most importantly, you shouldn't be alone right now." Edward opened his eyes slowly, feigning grogginess. The bright white hospital light hurt his eyes, but not as much as the prospect of explaining why no one had shown up to visit him in the last 6 hours. "Nurse, my children must be busy with New Year's preparations," he mumbled, trying to maintain his dignity even in the light blue hospital gown that made him feel more fragile than he liked. Margaret picked up a notepad and a pen from the bedside table. "I'll need their phone numbers, Mr. Morgan. It's hospital protocol. And besides, they have a right to know what happened to you." Reluctantly, Edward dictated the 3 numbers, each one etched in his memory like a painful reminder of conversations that rarely happened. Richard, his eldest, lived in a penthouse apartment Edward had bought for him in the city's most exclusive neighborhood. Patricia had a house in a gated community, also a gift from her father, while Camille lived in a smaller but equally luxurious mansion. "I'll call them now," Margaret said, walking to the landline on the desk beside the bed. "I'm sure they'll be worried and come right away." Edward closed his eyes and tried to mentally prepare for another family performance, where his children would show up just long enough to fulfill their basic social obligations. At least this time, he thought bitterly, they'd have a real excuse to feign concern. Margaret dialed the first number, Richard's. The phone rang several times before a sleepy, irritated voice answered. "Hello? Who is this? Do you know what time it is?" "Good evening. This is Nurse Margaret from St. Jude's Medical Center. I'm calling to inform you that your father, Edward Morgan, suffered a heart attack this afternoon and is here with us. He's stable." But the voice on the other end became more alert, but not in the way Edward had hoped. "Is he alive?" Richard asked with a coldness that cut through the room like a blade. "Yes, sir. Your father is stable, but he needs monitoring, and then it can wait," Richard interrupted, his tone betraying more annoyance than concern. "I'm in the middle of organizing an important party for tomorrow, and I can't leave now. If he's alive and stable, it's not urgent." Edward felt as if an invisible fist had punched him in the gut. He kept his eyes closed, pretending to be asleep. But each of his son's words echoed in his mind like an emotional death sentence. Margaret was silent for a few seconds, clearly shocked by the response. "Sir, your father had a heart attack. Even if he's stable, it's a serious situation that requires—" "Look, nurse," Richard said with growing impatience. "My father has the best health insurance, the best doctors. He's in good hands there. I'll try to stop by tomorrow if I have time." And he hung up. The silence that followed was deafening. Edward cracked his eyes open slightly and saw Margaret holding the phone, her expression a mixture of disbelief and indignation. She looked at him, realizing he was awake and had heard everything. "Mr. Morgan, maybe he's just in shock." She tried to smooth things over, but her voice lacked conviction. "Call the other 2, Edward said quietly, his voice heavy with a sadness that not even the heart attack had managed to provoke. "I need to know." Margaret hesitated but complied. She knew that sometimes the truth, no matter how painful, was necessary for a patient's complete healing. The next call would be to Patricia, and Edward braced himself for another dose of disillusionment that could be fatal to his already weakened heart. Margaret took a deep breath before dialing the second number, Patricia's. Her hands trembled slightly, still shaken by the coldness she had just witnessed. In 20 years as a nurse, she had seen many different reactions from families receiving news about hospitalized loved ones, but never anything so inhumane. Edward watched her every move, trying to decipher from her expression any sign of hope that at least one of his daughters would show a shred of genuine concern. His heart, already fragile from the attack, seemed to be bracing for another emotional blow. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, a female voice answered, but in the background, loud music, laughter, and the distinct chatter of a party could be heard. "Hello, who is this? I can barely hear with all this music." "Good evening, Miss Morgan. This is Nurse Margaret from St. Jude's Medical Center. I'm calling to inform you that your father, Edward Morgan, suffered a heart attack this afternoon and is with us." There was a pause on the other end. Edward could hear someone yelling to turn down the music. When Patricia spoke again, her voice conveyed more irritation than worry. "Seriously, tonight of all nights, nurse, I'm in the middle of a very important New Year's party. There are some very influential people here, you know. I can't just leave." "Ma'am, your father had a heart attack. He's stable, but this is a serious situation but he's okay, right? He's not going to die." Patricia cut in, her impatience chilling Edward's blood. "Because if he's stable, then it can wait until tomorrow. Or better yet, after New Year's." Margaret glanced at Edward, who had squeezed his eyes shut, as if he could physically block out the pain he was feeling. "Ms. Morgan, your father is alone, and—" "Look, nurse," Patricia said, raising her voice to compete with the music that had started blaring again. "My father has the money to pay for the best medical care. He's in good hands there. I'll try to stop by after the holiday, when things have calmed down." And she hung up, leaving only the sound of a dial tone echoing in the painful silence of the room. Edward opened his eyes, and Margaret saw silent tears streaming down the face of the man who, just hours ago, had been just another patient in her routine. Now he had become a broken human being whose emotional pain was clearly more intense than any physical discomfort. "Mr. Morgan, call Camille," he requested in a hoarse voice, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I need to know if at least one of them, if just one." His voice failed him. The words got lost in his throat, choked by the cruel reality that was unfolding. For all these years, he had deluded himself into thinking his children's love existed, even if it was conditional on money. Now he was discovering that not even a medical emergency could awaken in them a shred of true affection. Margaret hesitated before dialing the 3rd number. Part of her wanted to spare this man more suffering, but she knew he needed the whole truth to process the situation and, perhaps, find a way to move forward. Camille's phone rang several times before going straight to voicemail. Margaret hung up and tried again, voicemail again. "She's not picking up," Margaret reported softly. "Try one more time," Edward pleaded, clinging to a thread of hope. Maybe she's somewhere with bad service. The 3rd attempt yielded the same result. Camille, his youngest daughter, the one who used to be the most affectionate as a child, simply wasn't answering her phone while her father lay in a hospital bed after a heart attack. Edward closed his eyes and let the reality hit him with full force. 3 children, 3 reactions that ranged from absolute coldness to total indifference. None of them had shown even a minute of genuine concern for his well-being. "Nurse," he said after a few minutes of silence, "do you have children?" "I have 2, Mr. Morgan. A 15-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl. And if you were in the hospital, would they come?" Margaret felt her own eyes well up with tears. "Sir, my children would be frantic. They wouldn't leave my side for a second. Edward nodded slowly. "I raised monsters," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I thought I was being a good father, giving them everything they wanted, paying for everything they needed. But I raised monsters who only see me as a walking ATM." The silence that followed was heavy with a profound sadness. Edward was finally understanding that his excessive generosity hadn't brought love. It had destroyed any possibility of a genuine relationship with his children. And now, alone in a hospital room, he wondered if there was still time to fix what he had broken, or if he was doomed to live out the rest of his days in the gilded solitude he himself had created. The morning of December 30th arrived with a pale sun filtering through the blinds of the hospital room. Edward had spent a sleepless night, mentally replaying every cruel word he had heard during Nurse Margaret's phone calls. His body was recovering from the heart attack, but his soul seemed to be bleeding from a wound that all the medicine in the world couldn't heal. Margaret had gone home after her shift, but left a message with the day nurse, Carmen, a young woman in her 30s who showed the same genuine care for her patients. Carmen had tried to cheer Edward up with a special breakfast and words of encouragement, but she could tell the man was dealing with a pain that went far beyond the physical. "Mr. Morgan, I brought you your cell phone," Carmen said, handing him the device that had been collected from the mall along with his personal belongings. "Maybe you'd like to try calling your children again. Sometimes people react badly to the initial shock and regret it later." Edward took the phone with trembling hands, but instead of dialing, he decided to check social media. He had a discreet Instagram profile, which he mainly used to follow his children's lives, as it was practically the only way to know what was going on with them between their sporadic visits. What he saw on the screen made his heart race again, but this time it wasn't from a cardiac issue. It was pure outrage and pain. Richard had posted a photo just 2 hours earlier, showing himself on a luxurious yacht, holding a glass of champagne and smiling alongside several people Edward didn't recognize. The caption read, "Kicking off the New Year's festivities in style, the yacht life, NYE, living the good life." Edward immediately recognized the yacht. It was his own, which he kept docked at an exclusive marina, and that his children used freely whenever they wanted to impress friends or dates. The $3 million boat had become just another toy in the lives of his ungrateful children. With a racing heart, Edward scrolled down and found a post from Patricia made just an hour before. The photo showed her and several friends at a lavish party with gold decorations and a table laden with gourmet food. Everyone held glasses of expensive champagne, and Patricia was wearing a dress that Edward estimated cost over $5,000. Early New Year's party at the house, because life is meant to be lived with luxury and joy. Party time, NYE, luxury living. The caption read. Edward realized it wasn't just any house. It was the country estate he had bought for the family a few years ago, located in a gated community upstate. His children were using his property, drinking his champagne and spending his money to finance a party while he was in the hospital, alone, recovering from a heart attack. But it was the last discovery that almost made him pass out again. Camille had posted a series of Instagram stories showing a group of friends on an international trip. The images were from London, with the group visiting designer stores, expensive restaurants, and 5-star hotels. In one of the photos, Camille appeared holding several shopping bags with the caption, "Buying myself some New Year's gifts. Dad always said we deserve the best." Edward checked the post dates. Camille had been in London for 3 days, spending money on credit cards that he paid, living a life of luxury on the other side of the world while he was here, alone, recovering from a major cardiac event. Nurse Carmen approached the bed when she noticed Edward was very pale and breathing heavily. "Mr. Morgan, are you all right? Should I call the doctor?" Edward showed her the phone, his hands trembling with rage and disappointment. "Look where my children are, Carmen. Look how they're spending my money while I'm here, alone, recovering from a heart attack." Carmen looked at the images, and her expression turned to one of disbelief and indignation. As a nurse, she had seen many dysfunctional family dynamics, but never anything so cruel and inhumane. "Mr. Morgan, this is terrible. How can they be celebrating and spending money while you're here?" "Because to them, that's all I'm good for," Edward answered, his voice thick with emotion. "To bankroll their lifestyle. As long as I'm alive and the money keeps flowing, everything is fine. My health, my feelings, my loneliness, none of that matters." Edward put the phone away and turned to face the wall, trying to process the full extent of his children's cruelty. Not only had they ignored his medical condition, but they were celebrating and spending his money as if nothing had happened. "I raised 3 leeches," Edward muttered to himself. 3 people who only see me as a means to finance their whims, and the worst part is I let it happen." The realization that he had been a terrible father, not for a lack of love, but for an excess of misdirected generosity, began to form in his mind. He had taught his children to be consumerist, selfish, and insensitive, always shielding them from the consequences of their actions with his money. Now, alone in a hospital room, Edward began to understand that he might need to take drastic measures to try and salvage what was left of his dignity and, perhaps, awaken in his children some shred of humanity that might still exist within them. The late afternoon of December 30th brought with it an even deeper melancholy for Edward. He had spent the entire day trying to process the images he'd seen on social media, alternating between moments of intense anger and periods of overwhelming sadness. The cardiologist had visited that morning and approved his discharge for the next day, but Edward didn't know where to go or what to do with the devastating discovery about his children. The hospital was quieter than usual, as many staff members had been given time off to spend New Year's with their families. Only a skeleton crew was working through the holiday, and Edward felt even more alone, realizing that even the strangers around him had people who cared about them. It was then that he heard a soft noise in the hallway, the sound of a cleaning cart's wheels being pushed slowly, accompanied by a child's voice, softly humming a Christmas carol. The melody was simple and off-key, but it carried a genuine sweetness that contrasted dramatically with all the coldness Edward had experienced in the last 24 hours. His room door was slightly ajar, and he could see a woman in her 40s pushing the cleaning cart, wearing a light blue uniform and worn-out white sneakers. Beside her, a little girl held a duster too small for her hands, trying to help her mother with the seriousness of someone on a very important mission. The girl couldn't have been more than 7. Her brown hair was in 2 simple braids, and she wore a light pink dress that, though clean and well cared for, showed signs of heavy use. Her large, expressive eyes sparkled with a natural joy Edward hadn't seen in a long time. "Mommy, can I clean that room over there?" the child asked, pointing to Edward's door. "You can, my love, but remember what I said. If the patient is awake, you say hello politely and don't bother them. Okay?" "Okay, Mommy. I'll be very polite." Edward quickly shut his eyes, pretending to be asleep. He wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone, much less explain why a rich man like him was alone in a hospital during the holidays. The girl tiptoed into the room, clearly trying not to make any noise. Edward watched her discreetly through his half-closed eyelids as she wiped the bedside table with meticulous care, as if it were the most important thing in the world. Suddenly, she stopped cleaning and approached the bed. Edward could feel her watching him intently. "Mister," she whispered, "are you pretending to be asleep?" Edward opened his eyes, surprised by the child's perceptiveness. She looked at him with an expression of genuine curiosity, without fear or embarrassment. "How did you know?" he asked, trying to manage a smile he didn't feel. My teacher says that when people are really sleeping, they make funny noises and look all relaxed. You're all tense and not making any noise, she explained with the simple logic of a child. Edward couldn't help but smile genuinely for the first time in days. You're very smart. Thank you. My name is Sophia. Are you sad about something? The direct, innocent question caught Edward off guard. He looked into those big, sincere eyes, and for a moment, he felt the urge to pour out all his pain to this child who seemed to see right into his soul. I am a little sad. Yes, he admitted. Is it because you're sick? My grandma was sick once, and she got really sad too. It's not really about being sick, Edward replied, choosing his words carefully. It's because, well, it's kind of complicated to explain. Sophia put the duster down on the table and moved closer to the bed. Can I sit in this chair? I promise I won't be a bother. It's just that when someone is sad, you're not supposed to leave them alone. Edward was moved by the little girl's sensitivity. You can sit, yes. Sophia settled into the chair beside the bed, swinging her little legs that didn't reach the floor. You know, mister, my mum always says that when we're sad, it's good to talk to someone. Do you want to tell me why you're sad? Edward hesitated. How could he explain to a 7-year-old that his own children had abandoned him when he needed them most? How could he tell her he had discovered he was just a walking ATM to people who were supposed to love him unconditionally? Sophia, do you love your mum? He asked, changing the subject. I love her so much. She works really hard to take care of me, you know. And even when she's tired, she always gives me hugs and attention. And if your mum got sick, what would you do? Sophia looked at him as if the question were absurd. I'd take care of her, of course. I'd stay by her side the whole time, make her soup, give her medicine, and tell her stories so she wouldn't be sad. I would never leave my mommy alone if she was sick. The girl's simple, sincere answer hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. A 7-year-old child had a better understanding of love and family responsibility than his 3 adult children combined. Sophia, he said, his voice thick with emotion, you are a very special little girl. Thank you, and you seem special too. Can I ask you a question? You may. Why are you spending the holidays alone in the hospital? Where's your family? Sophia's question echoed in the quiet room, a painful reminder of the reality Edward was trying to avoid. He looked into her big, curious eyes, filled with an innocence that contrasted starkly with the cruelty he had experienced in the last few hours. My family, Edward began, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain to a child that his own children had abandoned him? How could he tell her that he had discovered he was nothing more than a source of money for people who were supposed to love him? They're traveling, he finally lied, trying to spare the girl from the harsh truth. They're busy with other things. Sophia tilted her head, studying Edward's face with the natural insight of a child who knows when an adult isn't being entirely truthful. But mister, if my family knew I was sick in the hospital, they would cancel any trip to be with me, she said with the simple, devastating logic of childhood. Family is for being together during the tough times, right? Edward felt tears welling in his eyes. The innocent wisdom of this child was exposing wounds he had been trying to hide, even from himself. Sophia, the girl's mother said, appearing at the doorway, don't bother the gentleman. He needs to rest. She's not bothering me at all, Edward quickly replied. In fact, she's been very pleasant company. The woman approached, pushing the cleaning cart. Edward could see she was young, probably in her 40s, with tired but kind eyes and hands marked by hard work. I'm Lucia. She introduced herself with a shy smile. I'm sorry if my daughter is being a nuisance. She's always been very curious and affectionate with everyone. On the contrary, Edward answered honestly, Sophia is doing me a world of good. The two of you are the only people who have shown any genuine interest in me since I got here. Lucia stopped cleaning and looked at Edward in surprise. What do you mean, sir? Hasn't your family come to visit? Edward hesitated, but something in the sincere expression of this simple woman made him want to be honest. My children. They're busy with their own lives. They couldn't make it. Sophia jumped up from her chair indignantly. What do you mean they couldn't come? You're sick. If I had a daddy, I would never leave him alone in the hospital. Especially now that it's almost New Year's. The girl's phrase struck Edward like lightning. If I had a daddy. She didn't have a father, yet she showed more love and care for a stranger than his own children showed for him. Sophia, that's not our business. Lucia chided gently, but Edward could see that she, too, was shocked by the situation. It's all right, Edward said. Sophia is right. My children, well, they aren't like you two. They don't care much about me beyond the money I can give them. The ensuing silence was heavy with sadness. Lucia stopped cleaning completely and approached the bed. Sir, forgive my prying, but how could your own children be like that? I would give anything for Sophia to have a father present in her life. I'd like to have a daddy too, Sophia said quietly, moving closer to the bed again. My mommy works so hard because it's just her to take care of me. If I had a daddy, he would help her and we would be a complete family. Edward felt his heart clench. Here was a child who dreamed of having a father, while his own children treated him like a burden. The irony was cruel and revealing. Sophia, Edward said softly, you and your mother are already a complete family. The love you have for each other is stronger than many families I know. But you don't have that love with your children, Sophia asked, with the innocent curiosity only a child possesses. Edward swallowed hard. I thought I did, but I discovered I was wrong. I always gave them everything they wanted. I thought that was love, but I actually spoiled them. They only see me as someone who pays their bills. Lucia sat down in the chair Sophia had occupied, her eyes full of compassion. Sir, may I say something? Sometimes giving everything isn't the same as giving love. I can't give Sophia everything she wants, but I give her all my affection, my time, my attention, and she gives it back. It's true, Sophia agreed excitedly. Mommy can't buy me expensive toys, but she makes paper toys for me, tells me stories, and plays with me even when she's tired. That's so much better than money. Edward began to understand where he had gone wrong. For all these years, he had confused financial generosity with paternal love. He had given his children everything money could buy, but he had never given them what truly mattered: time, attention, genuine affection, and most importantly, limits and responsibility. You know, Edward said thoughtfully, the two of you have taught me more about family in half an hour than I've learned in 70 years. Sophia smiled and impulsively took Edward's hand. Mister, do you want me to do something to make you less sad? I can draw you a star. My teacher says stars make wishes come true. Edward looked at the small girl, offering something made with her own hands, with pure, selfless love, and felt that perhaps there was still hope for his wounded heart. The contrast between Sophia and his children was so stark that Edward began to wonder if it wasn't time to make drastic changes in his life. The morning of December 31st came with Edward's discharge from the hospital, but his mind was far from celebratory. Lucia and Sophia had spent New Year's Eve cleaning the hospital rooms, and the little girl had kept her promise, handing Edward a simple drawing of a star made with a yellow crayon on recycled paper. Remember what I said? Mr. Sophia had told him as she gave him the drawing, make a wish on the star. They always listen when the wish comes from the heart. Edward had tucked the drawing into his shirt pocket with more care than he would a multi-million-dollar document. It was the first genuine gift he had received in years. The driver Edward had called took him to his mansion in the city's most exclusive neighborhood. But as they approached the gate, he realized something was very wrong. There were at least 15 cars parked on the street. Loud music blared from the well-kept gardens, and people he didn't know were milling about freely on the lawn. Mr. Morgan, the driver said hesitantly, it looks like there's a party going on at your house. Rage rose in Edward's chest like lava. Not only had his children ignored his hospitalization, but they had turned his home into a party venue while he was in the hospital recovering from a heart attack. "Stop right here," Edward instructed the driver. "I want to walk in." He walked slowly across the lawn that had been turned into a party zone. Plastic cups and empty bottles were strewn across the grass he tended with such care. The smell of alcohol and cigarettes polluted the air that was usually perfumed by the roses he had planted in his wife's memory. The front door was wide open, and Edward could see dozens of strangers occupying his living room. Drunk young people were dancing on the antique furniture he and his wife had collected over 40 years of marriage. His favorite armchair, where he used to read in the late afternoons, was stained with spilled drinks. "Excuse me," Edward said to a young man who was urinating in a planter by the entrance. "This is my house." The young man looked at Edward with contempt. "Oh, yeah, so what, old man? It's Richard's party. You got a problem. Take it up with him." Edward climbed the stairs toward his study, his private sanctuary, where he kept his most precious memories and important documents. The door was open, and inside he found Richard rummaging through his desk, clearly looking for something. "Richard," Edward said, his voice controlled but filled with fury. His eldest son turned, looking momentarily abashed to see his father, but he quickly regained his arrogant expression. "Dad! Glad you're out of the hospital. As you can see, I threw a party to celebrate your recovery." "A party to celebrate?" Edward repeated in disbelief. "Richard, you didn't even return my call. The nurse told me you hung up on her." "Oh, that?" Richard said, turning back to the papers on the desk. "I was busy organizing this surprise party for you." The blatant lie was the final straw. Edward walked over to Richard and snatched the papers from his son's hands. They were documents related to his will and information about his bank accounts. "What are you doing with these?" Edward asked in a dangerously low voice. "Dad, we need to talk about your finances. You're getting older. You had a heart attack. Maybe it's time for me to take on some responsibilities." Responsibilities. Something inside Edward snapped. "The only responsibility you want to take on is spending my money." At that moment, Patricia and Camille entered the study, both clearly intoxicated and annoyed at having their party interrupted. "Dad, you're being so dramatic," Patricia said, swaying slightly. "We knew you were fine, so we decided to celebrate." "Celebrate?" Edward looked at his 3 children with a clarity he had never had before. "Are you celebrating that I didn't die? Or are you disappointed that I survived?" "What kind of question is that?" Camille said. But her defensive tone revealed the question had hit its mark. Edward walked to the safe built into the wall, entered the combination, and removed all the important documents from inside. His children watched his every move, clearly worried about what he might be planning. 70 years, Edward murmured, more to himself. 70 years building a fortune, thinking I was securing my family's future. And I find out I've created 3 parasites who only know how to suck me dry. "Dad, you're just upset because of the heart attack," Richard tried, adopting a conciliatory tone that convinced no one. "Why don't you come downstairs, have a drink, and we can talk about this tomorrow?" Edward turned to his 3 children with an expression they had never seen before. It was a mixture of profound disillusionment, controlled anger, and, above all, determination. "I want all of you out of my house, now." "What do you mean, out of your house?" Patricia asked indignantly. "This is our house too." "No," Edward said calmly. "This house is mine. The bills I pay for you are mine. The cars, the yacht, the apartments, it's all mine, and you've just lost your access to all of it." The 3 siblings exchanged glances, realizing that something had fundamentally changed in their father. "Dad, you can't do this," Camille said, her voice panicking. "We're your family." Edward took the drawing of the star Sophia had made for him from his pocket. He looked at the simple piece of paper, made with love by a child who barely knew him, and then looked at the 3 adults before him, who had known him their entire lives but had never truly loved him. Family, Edward repeated softly, is what that little girl in the hospital showed me. Family is someone who worries when you're sick, who offers comfort when you're sad, who stands by your side in difficult times. He carefully put the drawing back in his pocket. You were never my family. You were just beneficiaries of my bank account. And with that declaration, Edward Morgan made the bravest decision of his life. It was time to start over. The three children stood in silence for a few seconds, processing their father's words. It was the first time in their lives Edward had spoken to them so directly and firmly. For decades, he had always given in to their whims, always found a way to smooth over any conflict with more money. "Dad, you can't be serious," Richard said, trying to laugh as if it were all a bad joke. "You always say things like this when you're upset, but you get over it." Edward walked to his desk, picked up the phone, and dialed a number he knew by heart. His children watched nervously, not understanding what he was doing. "Dr. Vance? It's Edward Morgan. I know it's a holiday, but I need to speak with you urgently. Yes, it's about changes to my will and other legal matters. Today? Perfect. I'll be there in an hour." He hung up and turned to his children, who now looked genuinely worried. "What are you going to do?" Camille asked, her voice trembling. "I'm going to correct the biggest mistake of my life," Edward answered calmly. "I'm going to stop financing your irresponsibility." "Dad, you're being irrational," Patricia tried. "We made a few mistakes, but that doesn't mean you should." "A few mistakes?" Edward interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. "Patricia, you spent $30,000 on my credit card last month. On what? Clothes, parties, and nonsense. Richard, you owe $200,000 in online gambling debts that I've been paying off for 2 years. And Camille, your trip to Europe cost more than 10 families make in a year." The three siblings glanced at each other, realizing their father knew far more about their spending than they had thought. "And you know what hurts the most?" Edward continued, his voice now thick with emotion. "It's not the money. It's the complete lack of consideration, of respect, of love. While I was in the hospital, alone, recovering from a heart attack, you were spending my fortune on parties and trips. We didn't know it was that serious," Richard tried to justify. "Of course you knew," Edward exploded. "The nurse called each one of you, explained that I'd had a heart attack and was in the hospital. And do you know what your reactions were? Richard said I could wait because he had a party to organize. Patricia said she couldn't leave her party because important people were there, and Camille just didn't answer her phone." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, the three children looked ashamed, but Edward could see it wasn't genuine remorse. It was just fear of losing their source of money. "Do you want to know what the moment was that changed everything for me?" Edward asked, taking the star drawing out of his pocket again. "It was when a 7-year-old girl, the daughter of the hospital cleaner, told me if I had a daddy, I would never leave him alone at a time like this." He showed the simple drawing to his children. "This child who barely knows me showed more love and concern for me in 1 hour than the 3 of you have in years." "Dad, that's ridiculous," Patricia said with a sneer. "You're going to compare your own children to some cleaner and her random kid." Patricia's words were like a slap in the face to Edward. Not only did she show a complete lack of remorse, but she also revealed the prejudice and arrogance he had instilled in them through a life of privilege without responsibility. "Some cleaner and her random kid," Edward repeated, incredulous. "Patricia, that random cleaner, works hard to support her daughter alone, and yet she still finds time to be kind and attentive. That random kid has a better understanding of family and love than the 3 of you combined." Edward walked towards the study door, but before leaving, he turned to his children one last time. "You have until the end of the day to leave my house and remove your belongings. Tomorrow, January 1st, I begin a new life, and you will learn to live without my money." "You can't do this!" Richard yelled, all his composure gone. "We have rights. We're your heirs." "You were," Edward corrected. Tomorrow, I'm going to my lawyer's office to change my will. I'm cancelling all the credit cards I pay for. I'm stopping the rent on your apartments, the car payments, everything. And who are you going to leave your inheritance to? Camille asked, desperate. Edward smiled for the first time in days. But it wasn't a happy smile. It was the sad smile of someone who finally saw the truth. To people who know the true value of love and gratitude. He walked down the stairs, leaving his 3 panicked children in the study. The party was still going on in the living room, but Edward no longer cared. He grabbed his car keys and left the house, heading for the law firm. During the drive, Edward thought about the irony of his situation. He had spent decades trying to buy his children's love, only to discover in the end that true love cannot be bought, only offered freely from genuinely caring hearts. The star drawing on the passenger seat seemed to symbolize a new hope. Sophia had told him to make a wish, and Edward knew exactly what he wished for. A second chance to understand what it truly meant to be a family. When he arrived at his lawyer's office, Edward was resolute. This wasn't just a decision made in the heat of anger. It was the conscious choice of a man who had finally woken up to reality and decided to honor the memory of his wife, who had always tried to warn him about the dangers of spoiling their children. It was time to do the right thing, even if it meant losing the 3 children he had raised, but who had never truly loved him. Dr. Arthur Vance had been Edward's lawyer for over 20 years and had never seen him so determined, yet so calm. The law firm was empty on New Year's Eve, but the lawyer had agreed to see his most important client on an urgent basis. "Edward, are you sure about this?" Dr. Vance asked for the 3rd time, adjusting his glasses as he read the documents Edward had requested. "Completely removing your children from the will and transferring the entire inheritance to people you've known for just 2 days. It's very radical." "Arthur," Edward replied calmly, sitting in the office's leather armchair, "in 2 days, Sophia and Lucia have shown me more love and consideration than my children have in decades. My decision is final." Edward had spent the previous afternoon researching Lucia Santos. He discovered she was a widow, having lost her husband in a workplace accident 3 years ago, and had been raising Sophia alone ever since. She worked 3 different jobs to afford the rent on a small apartment and her daughter's public school education. "I want to set up a trust fund," Edward continued. "The money will ensure Sophia gets the best possible education, that Lucia no longer has to work overnight shifts cleaning hospitals, and that they both have a comfortable, dignified life." Dr. Vance sighed, but began drafting the documents as requested. "And what about your children? They could contest this in court." "Let them," Edward said firmly. "I have records proving all their excessive spending, all the debts I've paid, all the irresponsibilities I've covered. Any judge will see they've already received far more than they ever deserved." While the lawyer worked, Edward picked up his phone and began executing the most painful but necessary part of his plan. He called the bank and cancelled all his children's supplementary credit cards. He called the real estate agency and terminated the leases on the apartments he paid for. He contacted the car dealership and requested the suspension of the vehicle financing. Each call was like cutting off a piece of himself. But Edward knew it was the only way to force his children to learn the real value of money and just maybe develop some sense of responsibility. "Done," Dr. Vance said after 2 hours of work. "All the documents are ready. But Edward, can I offer some advice as a friend? Perhaps you should talk to your children before taking such a definitive step." "Arthur, I've tried talking to them for 50 years, Edward replied, signing the documents. "The time for talk is over. Now is the time for consequences." When Edward arrived home at 8 that evening, the party was over, but the house was a wreck. Broken glasses, stained carpets, furniture out of place. His most precious memories had been desecrated by strangers his own children had invited. Richard, Patricia, and Camille were in the living room, waiting for him. Their faces showed a mixture of anger, desperation, and, for the first time in years, real fear. "Dad, you couldn't have been serious about cutting us out of the will," Camille said as soon as Edward walked in. "It's already done," he replied calmly, taking the documents from his briefcase. "And as of tomorrow, you will have to learn to live on your own resources." "Our own resources!" Richard exploded. "Dad, I don't have a job. You always said I didn't need one because you had enough money for all of us." "And there lies my greatest mistake," Edward admitted. "I deprived you of the dignity of work, of the satisfaction of achieving something on your own merit. You are healthy, intelligent adults. It's time you prove it." Patricia began to cry, not tears of sadness, but of financial panic. "Dad, I have a $20,000 credit card bill. How am I going to pay that?" "The same way millions of people pay their debts," Edward answered. "By working." "Work," Camille repeated, as if it were a foreign word. "Dad, we've never worked a day in our lives. We don't know how to do anything." "Then it's time you learned," Edward said, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. Lucia started working at 15 to help her family. Sophia, at 7, already understands the value of things and helps her mother where she can. You, at 40, 42, and 38, think work is beneath you. Edward walked through the ruined living room, surveying the damage. "Look at what you've done to the home where your mother and I built our most precious memories. You turned it into a set for a party with strangers." "Dad, we can fix this," Richard tried desperately. "We can start over, be better children." Edward stopped and looked at Richard with sadness. "Son, you are people in your 40s. If you haven't learned to be decent human beings by now, the fear of losing money isn't going to truly change you." He started up the stairs toward his bedroom but stopped halfway. "And you have until tomorrow morning to leave," he said without turning around. "I'll leave $5,000 for each of you as a start. After that, you're on your own." $5,000? Patricia shrieked. "Dad, that doesn't even cover a week of our expenses." "Then lower your expenses," Edward replied, continuing up the stairs. "Sophia and Lucia live on far less, and they are infinitely happier than you are." In his room, Edward locked the door and sat on the bed he had shared with his wife for decades. He picked up her picture from the bedside table and whispered, "Mary, you always said I was spoiling our children. You were right. But there's still time to do the right thing. I'm going to honor your memory by helping people who truly deserve it." He took Sophia's star drawing and placed it beside his wife's photo, two symbols of true love that would guide him on his new journey. Downstairs, he could hear his children arguing, shouting, panicking, but for the first time in years, Edward didn't rush to solve their problems with money. It was time for them to learn to solve their own issues. The painful but necessary transformation had begun. The dawn of January 1st brought an unusual silence to Edward's mansion. For the first time in decades, there was no noise of children fighting over money, no desperate calls asking for another little handout, no constant stress of fixing the problems they created with their irresponsibility. Edward woke up early, as was his habit, but this time he felt something different in his chest. Not the physical pain of the heart attack, but a strange sense of lightness mixed with melancholy. He had made the most difficult decision of his life, and now he had to live with the consequences. He went down to the living room and found the keys to all the cars he financed for his children arranged on the coffee table, along with cut-up credit cards and a handwritten note from Richard. "Dad, we hope one day you'll regret what you've done to us. We are your children, and that's supposed to mean something, but since it clearly means nothing to you anymore, we're leaving. Don't expect us to come back begging. We have our pride." Edward read the note and sighed. Even in their departure, his children displayed the same arrogance and inability to take responsibility for their actions. There wasn't a single word of remorse, no acknowledgement of their mistakes, just another attempt to make Edward feel guilty. He crumpled the note and threw it in the trash, along with the last shred of hope that his children might genuinely change. Edward spent the morning cleaning the house, removing the traces of the party that had desecrated his memories. Every broken glass he picked up, every stain he scrubbed, reinforced his conviction that he had made the right decision. Around 10 in the morning, the phone rang. Edward hesitated before answering, thinking it might be one of his children trying a new manipulation tactic. But the voice on the other end was different. It was Lucia, the cleaner from the hospital. "Mr. Morgan, I'm sorry to bother you on a holiday, but Sophia hasn't stopped talking about you since you left the hospital. She was worried because you seemed so sad." Edward felt his heart warm. "Lucia, how kind of you to call. How was your New Year's?" "Oh, sir, it was simple. I worked until 11. Then we went home and watched the fireworks on TV. Sophia drew another picture for you, a bigger star this time. She said you needed extra luck to be happy." Edward smiled genuinely for the first time in days. "Lucia, may I ask you a question? Do you two have any plans for today?" "No, sir. It's our day off. Why?" "I'd like to invite you both to have lunch with me. I have a proposal that could change both of your lives." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Morgan, that's very kind, but I don't know if that would be appropriate. You're an important man, and we're just—" "You are the two most important people I've met in years," Edward interrupted. "Please accept. I need to talk to you." 2 hours later, Edward was waiting anxiously at his front door when a taxi pulled up to the gate. Sophia jumped out of the car first, wearing a simple but clean floral dress, her hair in neat braids. Lucia followed, clearly nervous and uncomfortable, wearing her best clothes, a pair of jeans and a white blouse that, though humble, were immaculate. "Mister!" Sophia shouted, running towards Edward. "I brought your new star. This one is bigger and prettier." Edward knelt to receive the girl's spontaneous hug, feeling an emotion he had forgotten existed. This is what it felt like to be loved unconditionally, without financial interest, just for who you were as a person. "Sophia, what a joy to see you," Edward said, accepting the new drawing. And this star really is more beautiful than the first." Lucia approached shyly. "Mr. Morgan, your house is beautiful. I never imagined you lived in a place like this." "Lucia, welcome. This house was in need of people who know how to appreciate the good things in life without taking anything for granted." Edward led them to the dining room, where he had prepared a special lunch. Lucia looked around with respectful admiration, while Sophia explored everything with a child's natural curiosity. "Mister, why is your house so quiet?" Sophia asked. "Where's your family?" Edward felt a pang of pain, but also relief. "Sophia, my family, well, I discovered that true family isn't about who you're born to, but who chooses to stand by your side in difficult times." During lunch, Edward observed the dynamic between mother and daughter. Lucia patiently cut Sophia's food, taught her how to use the silverware correctly, and chatted with her about age-appropriate topics. It was a relationship built on love, mutual respect, and genuine care. "Lucia," Edward said after dessert, "I need to tell you something. Yesterday, I made a very important decision about my life." He took a deep breath and told them about discovering his children's ingratitude, his decision to change his will, and his desire to help people who truly deserved a better chance in life. "I want to create a trust fund for Sophia," Edward said, watching Lucia's shocked expression. "I want to ensure she gets the best possible education, that you no longer have to work 3 jobs, that you both have financial security forever." Lucia began to cry silently. "Mr. Morgan, that's impossible. Why would you do something like that for us?" "Because in 2 days, you taught me more about family than I learned in 70 years, Edward answered sincerely. "Sophia showed me that true love can't be bought, only offered. You showed me that dignity comes not from money, but from character." Sophia, who had listened intently, got up from her chair and ran to hug Edward. "Mister, does this mean you're going to be like a grandpa to me?" Edward felt his eyes fill with tears of joy. If you and your mother will let me, it would be the greatest honor of my life." For the first time in years, Edward Morgan felt like he was part of a real family. 2 weeks had passed since Edward had made the decisions that changed his life forever. Lucia had reluctantly agreed to quit 2 of her 3 jobs, keeping only her shift at the hospital so as not to feel completely dependent on Edward's generosity. Sophia was radiant at the prospect of attending a private school next semester and had filled the guest room of the mansion with her star drawings. Edward felt lighter and happier than he had in years. He woke up each morning eager to see Sophia playing in the garden and to talk with Lucia about plans for the girl's future. For the first time, he was building relationships based on genuine affection, not financial dependence. It was on a Monday afternoon, January 14th, that Edward received a call that would make his world crumble again. It was Dr. Vance, his lawyer, with an urgency in his voice that Edward had never heard before. "Edward, I need you to come to my office immediately," Dr. Vance said. "Your children, well, they've hired a law firm and are taking legal action against you." "What kind of action?" Edward asked, his stomach tightening. "They're challenging your mental capacity, claiming you've undergone psychological changes after the heart attack and are being manipulated by third parties with an interest in your fortune." Edward felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "They're saying I'm crazy." "Worse than that, Edward. They're alleging that Lucia and Sophia are opportunists who took advantage of your emotional vulnerability to benefit financially. They're petitioning to nullify all the will amendments and want to file for a conservatorship to take control of your assets." An hour later, Edward was in his lawyer's office, reading the documents his own children had filed against him. Every line was a stab to his already wounded heart. "According to the petition," Dr. Vance explained, "your children claim you were always a generous and loving father, that they always reciprocated your love appropriately, and that after the heart attack you developed a state of paranoia and irrational resentment." Edward read a part of the document aloud that particularly outraged him. "The petitioner exhibits erratic behavior and illogical financial decisions, influenced by opportunistic individuals who have taken advantage of his fragile condition for undue economic gain. They're painting Lucia and Sophia as manipulative gold diggers," Edward muttered angrily. "Adele, a 7-year-old child and a hard-working woman who barely accepts help without trying to repay it somehow." "There's more," Dr. Vance said hesitantly. "They've hired a private investigator to dig into Lucia's life. They're looking for anything they can use to discredit her." Edward stood up, pacing nervously around the office. "Arthur, is there anything they could find about Lucia that could hurt her?" "Edward, that doesn't matter. What matters is that they are willing to destroy an innocent woman's reputation and traumatize a child to get their hands on your money." At that moment, Edward's cell phone rang. It was Lucia, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. "Mr. Morgan, there are strange people asking questions about me in the neighborhood, at the hospital, at Sophia's school. They say they're lawyers and want to know about my life, about my relationship with you. Sophia is scared." Edward closed his eyes tightly. His children were not only attacking him, but they were also terrorizing 2 innocent people who had only shown him kindness and affection. "Lucia, come home immediately. I'll explain everything, and we'll handle this." When Lucia and Sophia arrived at the mansion an hour later, Edward could see the fear in both their eyes. Sophia hid behind her mother, clearly confused and frightened by the situation. "Mr. Morgan," Lucia said in a trembling voice, "what's happening? Why are these people asking questions about us? Did we do something wrong?" Edward knelt in front of Sophia, who was clearly distraught. "My dear, you and your mother have done nothing wrong. Some cruel people are trying to cause trouble for you because they don't like that I love you as my family. It's your children, isn't it?" Sophia asked, with the startling perception of a child. "Though they don't like that you have a new family." Edward nodded sadly. They're angry because they've discovered that real family can't be bought with money. Lucia sat down heavily on the sofa. Mr. Morgan, maybe it's best if we leave your life. We don't want to cause you any trouble. No, Edward said firmly. Lucia, you two are the best thing that's happened to me in years. I will not let three selfish, cruel people destroy our family. But sir, they're your children by blood, Lucia said. I have no right to stand between you. Edward took Lucia's hands in his. Lucia, family isn't a matter of blood. It's a matter of choice, of love, of mutual care. My biological children abandoned me when I needed them most. You two welcomed me without asking for anything in return. Sophia came closer and took Edward's free hand. Mister, I don't want you to be sad again. If your mean children are doing bad things, we just have to be stronger than them. Edward looked at the brave little girl and felt a determination he hadn't felt in years. Sophia was right. They had to be stronger than the cruelty of his biological children. Do you two trust me? Edward asked. We trust you, mother and daughter answered in unison. Then get ready, because we're heading into a battle, but we'll fight it together as a true family. And we're going to show everyone the difference between bought love and real love. Edward knew the war had just begun, but for the first time in his life, he had something truly worth fighting for, a family that loved him for who he was, not for what he had. The court hearing was scheduled for January 20th in a room at the city's main courthouse. Edward had spent the last few days preparing his defense with Dr. Vance, but he knew the battle would be far more emotional than legal. His children had hired one of the most renowned law firms in the city and were clearly willing to do anything to regain control of his inheritance. On the morning of the hearing, Edward dressed in his best suit but asked Lucia and Sophia to stay home to avoid any distress. The little girl had been very shaken by the investigators' visits, and Edward didn't want to expose her to the hostile environment of a courtroom. Mr. Morgan, Sophia said as he was leaving, handing him another star drawing, this is a special good luck star. I asked it to help you win against the mean children and for our family to stay together. Edward tucked the drawing into the inner pocket of his jacket, right next to his heart. Thank you, my dear. I'll carry your star with me. The courtroom was packed. On one side, Edward sat with Dr. Vance. On the other, Richard, Patricia, and Camille, accompanied by three lawyers in expensive suits. Edward looked at his children and felt a mixture of sadness and outrage. They looked confident, almost arrogant, as if they had already won. The judge, Robert Mendoza, a man in his 60s with graying hair and a serious expression, began the hearing by explaining that he would be reviewing Edward's mental capacity and the validity of the recent will amendments. The children's lawyer, Mr. Maurice Brand, presented his arguments first. He was an eloquent and persuasive man who painted Edward as an elderly man weakened by a heart attack, influenced by opportunistic people who had taken advantage of his emotional vulnerability. Your Honor, Mr. Brand said, Mr. Edward Morgan has always been a dedicated and generous father. His children, Richard, Patricia, and Camille, have always returned that love with affection and respect. After his heart attack, however, the respondent developed a state of paranoia and unjustified resentment against his own children. Edward felt anger rising in his chest as he listened to the lies being presented as truth. Even more serious, the lawyer continued, is the influence of third parties with an interest in his fortune. A cleaner and her daughter managed, in a matter of days, to convince a confused man to completely alter his will in their favor. When it was Richard's turn to testify, Edward barely recognized his son. Richard spoke with tears in his eyes about how he had always loved his father, how he had always been grateful for everything he received, and how worried he was about his father's mental state. Your Honor, Richard said in a choked voice, my father has always been our hero. He never denied us anything because he loved us. Now, malicious people are taking advantage of him. It is our duty as his children to protect him. even if he doesn't understand it right now. Edward watched the performance in disbelief. Richard was playing the part of the loving, concerned son with frightening naturalness. If Edward didn't know the truth, even he might have believed the act. Patricia and Camille followed the same script, crying and talking about the love they had always felt for their father, their concern for his mental state, and the need to protect him from opportunistic people. When it was Edward's turn to defend himself, he rose slowly. He knew this was the most important moment of his life. It wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about defining what family truly meant. "Your Honor," Edward began, his voice firm. "My children are lying, and they know they're lying." He took his cell phone from his pocket and showed it to the judge. "I have here the posts my children made on social media while I was in the hospital with a heart attack. Richard posted pictures of himself partying on my yacht. Patricia posted photos from a party at my country estate. Camille was spending my money in London." Edward showed the images to the judge, who analyzed them with growing attention. "While I was alone in the hospital, recovering from a heart attack, my children were spending my money on parties and trips. When the nurse called them, Richard said I could wait because he had more important things to do." The children glanced at each other nervously. They clearly hadn't expected Edward to have this evidence. "Your Honor," Edward continued, "for 70 years, I confused generosity with love. I gave my children everything money could buy, but I never demanded responsibility, gratitude, or character from them. I raised 3 adults who see me only as a financial resource." Edward took Sophia's drawing from his pocket. "This star was made by a 7-year-old girl who barely knows me, but was concerned when she saw me looking sad. In 2 days, Sophia and her mother Lucia showed me more genuine love than my biological children have in decades." The judge looked at the simple drawing with interest. "Your Honor, I am not crazy. I am lucid for the first time in years. I've discovered that true family is not a matter of blood, but of choice. I choose Sophia and Lucia as my family because they chose me when I needed them most." Edward turned to look his children directly in the eye. "Richard, Patricia, Camille, you had your entire lives to learn to truly love me. You chose to see me only as a bank. Now you will have to learn to live without my money." The silence in the room was absolute. The judge spent a few minutes reviewing the documents and the evidence presented. "Mr. Morgan," the judge finally said, "are you absolutely certain of your decisions?" "I am, Your Honor, and I ask only one thing, that Sophia and Lucia be protected from any retaliation. They are innocent in this situation." The judge retreated to his chambers to deliberate, leaving the 2 families, the biological and the chosen, to await the verdict that would define all of their futures. After 2 hours of deliberation, Judge Robert Mendoza returned to the courtroom. His serious face gave no clue as to his decision, but Edward could tell the judge had carefully weighed all the evidence. After a thorough review of the facts and evidence presented, the judge began, "I must announce my decision regarding the mental capacity of Mr. Edward Morgan and the validity of his testamentary dispositions." The silence in the room was absolute. Edward's heart was racing, not with fear, but with hope. He knew he had spoken the truth and that the evidence was on his side. "First," the judge continued, "regarding the claim of mental incapacity, after examining the medical reports, the evidence presented, and the testimony of the respondent himself, I find that Mr. Edward Morgan is in full command of his mental faculties. The heart attack did not affect his ability to reason, judge, or make decisions." Richard, Patricia, and Camille exchanged glances of growing concern. "As for the allegations of manipulation by third parties," the judge went on, "the evidence demonstrates the exact opposite of what the petitioners have claimed. The social media posts presented by Mr. Morgan prove that his biological children showed a complete disregard for his medical condition, preferring to continue their leisure activities rather than support their father during his recovery. The judge paused, looking directly at the three children. Even more serious are the bank records showing excessive and irresponsible spending by the petitioners, all financed by Mr. Morgan over decades. The documents prove a pattern of total financial dependence and a lack of reciprocal affection. Edward felt a wave of relief but maintained his composure. On the other hand, the judge continued, I find no evidence whatsoever that Mrs. Lucia and Sophia solicited, suggested, or manipulated Mr. Morgan to obtain financial advantages. On the contrary, testimony indicates they initially resisted his offers of help. Mr. Brand, the children's lawyer, tried to speak, but the judge silenced him with a gesture. Therefore, the judge said in a firm voice, I find the petition for a conservatorship to be without merit, and I declare all will amendments made by Mr. Edward Morgan to be valid. The respondent is fully capable of managing his assets and making decisions about his inheritance. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, feeling immense gratitude. Justice had prevailed. Furthermore, the judge added, I order the petitioners to pay all court costs and to immediately cease any investigation or harassment of Ms. Lucia and Sophia, under penalty of being held in contempt for legal harassment. Richard stood up abruptly, no longer able to maintain the facade of a loving son. This is absurd. That old fool is being manipulated by a pair of gold diggers. Silence, the judge ordered. Mr. Morgan, your reaction only confirms my decision. A son genuinely concerned for his father's well-being would respect his choices, even if he disagreed with them. Patricia began to cry, but they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of anger and frustration at having lost access to the inheritance. Dad, Camille said desperately, you're going to regret this. When those people show their true colors, it will be too late. Edward stood and looked at his three children with a mixture of sadness and determination. My children, he said calmly, you had your whole lives to show me your true colors. It's already too late for me, but not for you. You can still learn to be better people, to build relationships based on love and respect, not on financial interest. We don't need your lectures, Richard shouted, and you'll see those people will abandon you as soon as the money runs out. Edward smiled sadly. Richard, if they do, they will still have given me more joy in a few weeks than you have in decades. At least I will have experienced what it's like to be loved for who I am, not for what I have. The three children left the courtroom in silence, followed by their defeated lawyers. Edward knew he would probably never see them again, but he felt at peace with that possibility. Dr. Vance shook Edward's hand with satisfaction. Edward, you were brave. It couldn't have been easy to face your own children like that. Arthur, Edward replied, for the first time in my life, I fought for something that was truly worth it, a family built on real love. When Edward got home, he found Lucia and Sophia waiting anxiously in the living room. Sophia ran to hug him as soon as he walked in. So, mister, did the star work? Edward picked the little girl up and smiled. It worked perfectly, my dear. Our family is safe. Lucia began to cry with relief. Mr. Morgan, I was so scared that... You don't have to be scared of anything anymore, Edward said, embracing them both. Now we're officially a family, recognized even by the courts. Sophia clapped her hands with joy. Can I call you Grandpa Edward now? It would be the greatest honor of my life, Edward replied, feeling he had finally found his place in the world. That night, for the first time in years, Edward slept with a clear conscience. He had lost 3 children who had never truly loved him, but he had gained a family that had chosen him for no other reason than pure, genuine love. The battle was over, and true love had won. 6 months had passed since the hearing that definitively changed Edward's life. It was a sunny July morning when he awoke to the sound of laughter coming from the garden. Through the window, he watched Sophia playing with a doll he had bought for her. Not an expensive designer doll, but a simple, colorful one the girl had picked out herself at a neighborhood toy store. The mansion had been sold. Edward now lived in a comfortable but much simpler house in the same neighborhood where Lucia and Sophia had lived before. It was a 3-bedroom house with a small but well-tended garden and a kitchen where every morning Lucia prepared breakfast for their chosen family. Edward went down to the kitchen and found Lucia making pancakes, a tradition they had established on Sundays. She wore a simple apron and hummed a song Sophia had learned at her new school, a good-quality private school, but without the ostentation, where the girl was thriving both academically and socially. "Good morning, Lucia," Edward said, kissing the forehead of the woman who had become so much more than a caregiver. She had become his life partner, his co-parent in raising Sophia, his true family. "Good morning, Edward," she replied with the warm smile he had grown to love. "Sophia is excited to tell you her school news. It seems she was chosen to create a drawing to represent her class at the science fair." Edward smiled. Sophia had discovered a natural talent for drawing that went far beyond paper stars. Her creations now adorned the walls of the house, constant reminders that life's most valuable gifts were priceless. "And how are you feeling?" Lucia asked, watching Edward with the caring attention she always showed. "Today marks exactly 6 months since I made the best decision of my life," Edward completed, hugging her around the waist. "Lucia, have you ever once regretted agreeing to be part of this crazy family?" Lucia laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. "Edward, you transformed our lives. Sophia has opportunities I could never have given her alone, and I can work just part-time and still have time for my family. But do you know what's most important?" "What?" "Sophia has a father figure, a grandfather, a man who truly loves her and is teaching her values that no amount of money can buy." Just then, Sophia ran into the kitchen, holding a colorful envelope. "Grandpa Edward, Mommy Lucia." A letter from school arrived. Edward and Lucia exchanged amused glances. Sophia had naturally started calling Lucia Mommy and Edward Grandpa, and those simple words held more value than all the titles and accolades Edward had received in his business career. "What does the letter say, my dear?" Edward asked, lifting Sophia into his arms. "The teacher wrote that I was the best student of the semester in art, and that my drawing about family is going to be displayed in the main hall of the school." Edward felt his eyes well up with tears of pride. "And what is your drawing about family about?" Sophia smiled with the innocent joy that had become the light of Edward's life. "It's about the 3 of us. I drew you, me and Mommy Lucia in our house, with lots of stars in the sky, because stars are for making wishes for good things." "And what wish did you make?" Lucia asked, stroking the girl's hair. "I wished for our family to stay together forever, and for Grandpa Edward to never be sad again like he was that day in the hospital." Edward hugged Sophia tightly, feeling an emotion he couldn't express in words. This child had not only saved his emotional life, but had taught him the true meaning of legacy. Later, during the Sunday lunch that had become a sacred tradition, Edward watched his small family and reflected on the journey that had brought them there. He had lost a fortune, a mansion, 3 biological children, and the luxurious lifestyle he had maintained for decades. In return, he had gained something infinitely more valuable: true love, a purpose in life, and the certainty that he was making a difference in the lives of people who truly mattered. You know," Edward said, interrupting the lively conversation between Lucia and Sophia about plans for the school holidays, "I have a confession to make." The two looked at him curiously. "For the past few months, I've been thinking a lot about my mistakes as a father. I realized that for my whole life, I confused giving gifts with giving love, financial generosity with generosity of the heart." Edward took both Lucia's and Sophia's hands. But you two taught me that the true inheritance we can leave for those we love isn't in money or property. It's in the love we plant in their hearts, the happy memories we create together, the values we pass on." Sophia tilted her head thoughtfully. "Grandpa, does that mean that when I grow up, I'll always remember how much you loved me?" "Exactly, my dear. And I hope you teach your own children that true family isn't about blood or money. It's about choosing to love and care for one another every single day." Lucia squeezed Edward's hand. "Edward, you didn't just give us a new life. You gained one too. Just look at how you've changed. Lighter, happier, more human." Edward smiled, remembering the lonely, bitter man who had collapsed in the mall on that cold December afternoon. That man had symbolically died on the marble floor, and in his place, someone had been born who finally understood what truly mattered in life. "Do you know what I wish for the future?" Edward asked, glancing at Sophia's drawing taped to the refrigerator, a new, more elaborate star, representing the three of them as a united family. "What?" mother and daughter asked in unison. "And I wish our story would inspire other people to understand that it's never too late to start over, never too late to find a real family, and never too late to discover that love can't be bought, it can only be offered." That afternoon, while Sophia drew more stars in the garden and Lucia read a book on the porch, Edward sat in his favorite armchair, no longer the Italian leather one from the mansion, but a simple fabric armchair that Lucia had chosen to match the cozy decor of their new home. He looked at the drawing of the first star Sophia had made for him in the hospital, now framed and hanging on the main living room wall. That simple star, made with crayon on recycled paper, was worth more than all the expensive works of art he had once owned. Edward closed his eyes and made one last wish to the star, that every parent in the world would understand that the greatest gift they can give their children is not a full bank account, but a heart full of true, unconditional love. When he opened his eyes, he saw Sophia running towards him with another paper star, and he knew his wish was already being answered. After all, he was raising a new generation, a girl who would grow up knowing that a real family is built with love, not with money. Edward Morgan's story had ended like a true fairy tale, not with riches and castles, but with love, family, and the certainty that he had found the most valuable treasure of all, a home where he was loved for who he was, not for what he had.